At 4:50 a.m. on February 24th, 2022, Russian tanks began rolling into Ukraine. Within minutes, missiles struck Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Hours later, Vladimir Putin addressed the world, calling it a special military operation to defend Russia's security and history. But this was not the first warning. In 2014, Russia took Crimea without a declaration of war. What began quietly then returned violently in 2022. We are told this war is about NATO, language, or territory. But those explanations only describe the surface. In today's video, we will dive deep into history to understand the real historical reasons behind this war. Because this conflict did not begin in our lifetime. To understand why Russia invaded Ukraine, we must go back, not decades, but centuries. This is before Russia existed, before Ukraine existed, before any czar ruled from Moscow. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, Eastern Europe was dominated by a medieval state known as Kievan Rus. At its height, Kievan Rus stretched across vast lands that today belong to multiple modern countries. Its territory included most of present-day Ukraine, large parts of Western Russia, almost all of modern Belarus, and regions that now lie in Poland and Lithuania. There were no fixed national borders as we understand them today. Power flowed along rivers, trade routes, and cities, not along lines on a map. At the center of this world stood Kiev. Kiev was not a frontier city. It was the political, economic, and cultural heart of Kievan Rus. It controlled trade routes linking Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the wider European world. At this time, Moscow did not yet matter. It was a small settlement in forested northern lands, far from the center of power. The people of Kievan Rus shared language roots, customs, legal traditions, and a common elite culture. From this single civilization would later emerge Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. This is why all three trace their origins here. But history is shaped not only by geography, it is shaped by belief. In 988 AD, Kievan Rus adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This decision tied religion directly to political power. Rule became sacred, authority became historical, and Kiev became not just a capital, but the spiritual center of the Rus world. For centuries, this shared geography, culture, and faith held the Rus lands together. But this unity existed before czars, before empires, and before modern nations, and it would not survive what came next. In 988 AD, the rulers of Kievan Rus made a decision that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. They adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine world. This was not just a religious conversion, it was a political transformation. By embracing orthodoxy, the rulers of Kievan Rus connected themselves to one of the most powerful civilizations of the time, the Byzantine Empire. Religion now provided moral authority, political legitimacy, and historical continuity. The ruler was no longer just a leader. He ruled by divine sanction. Church and state became inseparable. And at the center of this sacred order stood Kiev. Kiev was not only the political capital of Kievan Rus, it was its spiritual heart. Churches, monasteries, and religious schools made Kiev the center of Orthodox life for the entire Rus world. For centuries, religious authority flowed outward from Kiev to other Rus lands. This mattered, because legitimacy in medieval Eastern Europe came not from conquest alone, but from recognition by the Church. When power later shifted north, this religious inheritance did not disappear. It was claimed. As Kiev declined after invasions and fragmentation, new centers of power sought to inherit its sacred legacy. Moscow would later present itself not merely as a political successor, but as the protector of Orthodox Christianity. Over time, Moscow developed a powerful idea that it was the rightful heir to the spiritual authority of Kievan Rus, that it was the guardian of the true faith, and therefore the guardian of history itself. This belief would become central to Russian state identity. It is why religion in Russia was never just personal, it was civilizational. Even today, when modern language speaks of security and borders, older ideas still echo beneath the surface. Ideas about sacred history, about inherited legitimacy, about who has the right to lead the Rus world. These ideas were born here, long before modern nations existed, and they would soon be tested by violence. In the 13th century, history arrived not as an idea, but as force. From the east came the armies of the Mongol Empire. They moved faster than any army Europe had ever faced. They did not negotiate. They did not integrate. They destroyed. Between 1237 and 1240, Mongol forces swept across the Rus lands. City after city fell, and in 1240 they reached Kiev. Kiev, once the heart of Kievan Rus, was besieged, breached, and burned. Its population was decimated. Its churches were destroyed. Its political authority collapsed. This was not just the fall of a city, it was the end of Kievan Rus as a unified civilization. The Mongols did not rebuild what they destroyed. They ruled through fear, tribute, and submission. The Rus lands fragmented into smaller principalities, each forced to pay tribute to distant Mongol rulers. But history does not end in destruction. It reorganizes. While Kiev lay in ruins, power began to shift north. Small settlements in forested regions, once distant and insignificant, adapted to Mongol rule. Among them was Moscow. Moscow survived by cooperating, by collecting tribute, and by mastering the politics of survival. It did not resist the Mongols openly, it learned from them. Over time, Moscow grew stronger while older centers faded. This mattered deeply because the Mongol period reshaped political culture. It rewarded centralized authority obedience, ruthless efficiency, and it punished fragmentation. When Mongol power eventually weakened, the Rus lands that emerged were no longer the same. The unity of Kievan Rus was gone. In its place stood a new political reality, one shaped by survival under domination. The scars of this period would last for centuries. They would define how power was understood, how authority was enforced, and how history itself was remembered. After the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the Rus world did not rebuild as one. By the early 1300s, two distinct paths had already begun to form. In the 14th century, the political center of the northern Rus lands shifted steadily toward Moscow. Moscow's rulers survived by cooperating with the Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde. They collected tribute on the Mongols' behalf, enforced centralized authority, suppressed rival princes. This system rewarded obedience and concentration of power. By 1380, Moscow had emerged as the dominant northern principality. By 1480, it formally broke free from Mongol control, but the political culture shaped under Mongol rule remained. By the late 15th century, Moscow had developed absolute rule, centralized taxation. Strong military authority power flowed downward from the ruler. This would later become the foundation of the Russian state. During the same period, the lands of present-day Ukraine followed a very different trajectory. From the 14th century onward, most Ukrainian territories came under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Later, after 1569, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth here, power was structured differently. By the 15th and 16th centuries, cities received legal rights under European law. Local nobility negotiated power with rulers. Religious diversity was tolerated, authority was shared, not absolute. Local self-governance became normal. By the 16th century, the contrast was clear. In Moscow, the ruler was unquestioned, the state was centralized, unity was enforced in Ukrainian lands. Authority was negotiated, local autonomy persisted, identity became regional and cultural. By the time Moscow crowned its first czar in 1547, Ukraine was already embedded in a different political world. To Moscow, this divergence was temporary, a deviation to be corrected. To Ukraine, it was history unfolding naturally. By the 17th century, these two political cultures had hardened. One believed order came before freedom. The other had learned to live with pluralism and negotiation. They no longer merely differed. They understood power differently. By the mid-17th century, the two paths that had diverged after the Mongol era collided again. This time, not through invasion alone, but through empire. In 1654, Ukrainian Cossack leaders, seeking protection amid regional wars, entered into an agreement with Russia known as the Pereyaslav Agreement. To Moscow, this moment marked a reunification of historic Rus lands. To Ukrainian leaders, it was meant to be a limited alliance. Military support, not absorption. The two sides understood the agreement differently. That difference would define the next centuries. In the late 17th century, Ukraine retained limited self-rule under Cossack leadership. But Moscow steadily reduced this autonomy, step by step. Local institutions were replaced. Authority shifted northward. Military command was centralized by the early 1700s. Ukraine's political independence existed mostly on paper. Under rulers like Peter the Great, Russia transformed into a European-style empire. This expansion demanded uniform control. Ukraine's separate traditions became a problem. By the mid-18th century, Ukrainian autonomy was formally abolished. Local elites were absorbed into Russian nobility. Administrative control was centralized. Ukraine was no longer a partner, it was a province. As imperial rule hardened, so did cultural policy. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Ukrainian language was restricted, education was Russified, Ukrainian history was reframed as regional folklore. The term Little Russia entered official use, not as geography, but as hierarchy. Ukraine was presented not as a nation, but as a regional branch of a greater whole. To the Russian Empire, this was not conquest, it was completion. Ukraine was seen as historically Russian, spiritually inherited, politically unfinished to Ukrainian society. This was something else entirely. It was the loss of autonomy, language, historical voice. Two narratives emerged, both rooted in history, but moving in opposite directions. By the early 20th century, the old empires of Europe were collapsing. The Russian Empire fell in 1917, destroyed by revolution and war. For Ukraine, this moment briefly reopened history. In the chaos following the Russian Revolution, Ukraine declared independence. For the first time in centuries, a Ukrainian state reemerged. Fragile, divided, but real. That window was short. Between 1918 and 1921, Bolshevik forces moved to reclaim the former imperial territories. By 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the newly formed Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Officially, this was a union of equals. In reality, political power was centralized elsewhere. During the 1920s, the Soviet state promoted limited Ukrainian language and culture under a policy of controlled inclusion. This period created the appearance of autonomy, but key decisions, economic, political, military, were not made in Kiev. They were made at the center, and by the end of the decade, that center tightened its grip. Ukraine has long been known as the breadbasket of Europe. Its black soil, Chernozem, is among the most fertile farmland in the world. Before the famine, Ukraine produced massive grain surpluses that fed much of the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, Ukraine's population was approximately 32 million people, largely rural, agricultural, and dependent on farming. Yet it was here, in one of the most fertile regions on the continent, that one of the worst famines of the 20th century unfolded. Between 1930 and 1933, the Soviet leadership imposed forced collectivization. Private farms were abolished. Grain was seized by the state. Production quotas were set beyond realistic capacity. In Ukraine, these policies were enforced with particular severity. By 1932, grain requisitions continued even after villages had nothing left. Food was taken seed by seed. Movement was restricted. Borders between regions were sealed. People could not leave to search for food. This was not a natural disaster. It was the result of state policy. Between 1932 and 1933, historians estimate that 3 to 5 million people died in Ukraine from starvation. Entire villages vanished. Families disappeared. This catastrophe became known as the Holodomor, a word meaning death by hunger. Debates over intent continue among historians, but the outcome is not debated. Millions died in a land that should not have starved. After the famine, organized resistance collapsed. By the late 1930s, Ukrainian intellectuals were purged. Cultural institutions were dismantled. History was rewritten. During World War II, Ukraine became one of the most devastated regions in Europe. After 1945, reconstruction came with tighter political control. Dissent was no longer tolerated. Memory itself became dangerous. In 1954, Crimea was transferred from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. At the time, this was an internal administrative decision. Within the Soviet system, borders were symbolic. Sovereignty did not exist. Authority remained centralized. For decades, Ukraine remained economically vital to the Soviet Union. It was an industrial base, an agricultural core, a strategic region. Living standards improved, but political autonomy did not. Decisions affecting Ukraine were made far from Kiev. By the 1980s, the Soviet system was stagnating. Its control endured, but its legitimacy was fading. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine held a national referendum. An overwhelming majority voted for independence. This time, independence was not symbolic. It was legal. Ukraine emerged as a sovereign state, recognized internationally, including by Russia. But history does not dissolve overnight. The Soviet era had bound Ukraine and Russia through institutions, memory, trauma, and loss. Those ties did not disappear. They lingered quietly. In 1991, Ukraine became independent by law, but independence did not erase history. It exposed it. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine emerged as a sovereign nation. Its borders were internationally recognized, including by Russia. Ukraine inherited a large population, major industrial capacity, vast agricultural land, and the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, but sovereignty came with vulnerability. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum. In exchange, it received security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. These were political guarantees, not military ones. At the time, this seemed enough. The 1990s were a decade of economic shock. Ukraine's economy shrank sharply. Living standards fell. State institutions were weak. Russia faced similar turmoil, but the relationship between the two states was unequal. Ukraine remained deeply dependent on Russia for energy trade infrastructure. At the same time, Ukraine was trying to define itself as a separate political entity. This tension never fully resolved. By the late 1990s, Ukraine stood between two gravitational forces. To the east, economic ties with Russia, shared Soviet infrastructure, cultural familiarity. To the west, European markets, political reform models, institutional integration. Ukraine's leadership oscillated between these poles. This was not indecision, it was survival. In 2004, mass protests erupted in Ukraine after a disputed presidential election. The Orange Revolution was not about geopolitics. It was about governance. Ukrainians demanded fair elections, accountability, political legitimacy. But from Moscow's perspective, the event looked different. It appeared as Western influence, popular revolt against established power. A challenge to regional control trust eroded further. By the early 2000s, Russia had stabilized economically and reasserted state authority. Its leadership increasingly viewed the post-Soviet space as a zone of special interest. Ukraine was central to that view, not just strategically, but historically. To Russia, Ukraine was not simply a neighbor. It was part of a shared past that had never been fully relinquished. In 2010, Ukraine elected a president who pursued closer ties with Russia, but the balance remained fragile. In 2013, Ukraine prepared to sign an association agreement with the European Union. At the last moment, the decision was suspended. Mass protests followed. These protests were not about NATO. They were about corruption, governance, direction. But once again, events inside Ukraine were interpreted elsewhere as geopolitical realignment. The uneasy coexistence was ending. In 2014, history stopped whispering. It spoke aloud. In early 2014, Ukraine was in political turmoil. After months of protests, the sitting president fled the country. For Moscow, this moment was not viewed as an internal Ukrainian crisis. It was seen as a strategic rupture. Power had shifted, suddenly and unpredictably, in a country Russia had never fully accepted as separate. Crimea is not just a peninsula. It is a place layered with history. It was part of the Russian Empire, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, transferred to Ukraine in 1954 during the Soviet era within the Soviet Union. That transfer carried little meaning. Borders were administrative. Power was centralized. But after 1991, those internal borders became international ones. For Russia, Crimea remained emotionally and strategically unresolved. In March 2014, Russian forces entered Crimea. Within weeks, a referendum was held under military presence. Russia formally annexed the peninsula. From Moscow's perspective, this was not aggression. It was framed as historical correction, protection of Russian speakers, reunification of historic land. From Ukraine's perspective, and that of most of the international community, it was a violation of sovereignty. Sanctions followed. Diplomacy froze. But the deeper shift had already occurred. Crimea marked a turning point. For the first time since 1991, Russia had redrawn post-Soviet borders by force. It demonstrated something crucial, that history, not treaties, would guide future decisions. The war in eastern Ukraine that followed remained limited in scale, but the precedent was set. Borders were no longer final. In 2022, history returned, not as symbolism, but as war. At 4:50 a.m. on February 24, 2022, Russian forces crossed into Ukraine from multiple directions. Missiles struck major cities. Europe's largest land war since World War II had begun. But the invasion was not framed as a conventional military operation. It was framed as history restored. In speeches leading up to the invasion, Vladimir Putin did not speak primarily of territory. He spoke of history, identity, unity. Ukraine was described not as a sovereign nation with a separate path, but as an artificial state created by historical accident. This was not new rhetoric. It echoed centuries-old narratives about inheritance, legitimacy, and unfinished history. NATO expansion mattered, security concerns mattered, but they were not the origin. They were the trigger. The deeper issue was this: Ukraine was moving, politically, culturally, and economically, away from Russia. Not temporarily, but permanently. For Moscow, this represented not just loss of influence, but loss of history. This war is not only about land, it is about who gets to define the past. Ukraine's post-1991 path challenged a long-held belief that the Rus world must remain unified. The invasion of 2022 was an attempt to enforce a historical narrative through force. Wars over borders can be negotiated. Wars over identity cannot. This conflict is rooted in competing histories, divergent political cultures, unresolved imperial memory. That is why ceasefires collapse. That is why compromise is fragile. Because beneath the tanks and missiles lies a deeper struggle over history itself.